After my father-in-law passed away, I was left to handle the factory payroll. My husband's cousin started mocking me in meetings, saying, "Oh look, the housewife wants to play boss." 2 months later, the factory voted me CEO when they found out what I did with their bonuses. Why are they even here if they don't do anything? I whispered to Roland as we sat in the conference room. They think they're entitled to it, he replied with a sigh. It's always been that way. But you don't have to take it, Mireille. He was right. I didn't. I just didn't know yet that in 2 months, everything would flip, and I'd be the one in charge. When I married into the Leclerc family, I didn't think I'd ever be involved in their family business. Their steel manufacturing factory had been running for generations, tucked into a quiet district of Cleveland. Roland, my husband, worked under his father, August, for over 20 years. The place was more than a business, it was the Leclerc identity. I was, in everyone's eyes, just the wife. I didn't mind it. I ran our home, raised our 2 sons, and took care of Roland's aging parents when they needed help. I cooked meals for the staff Christmas parties, helped organize birthdays, and sometimes dropped off lunchboxes at the factory if Roland forgot. That was the extent of my involvement. Nothing more. No one expected me to know about taxes or steel inventory or workforce scheduling. And I didn't argue. I was content in my role. Then August died. It was sudden, a heart attack. A man who was still walking the factory floor at 72 just dropped in his driveway one morning. It hit Roland hard. But it hit the factory even harder. August was beloved, especially by the older workers who'd been around since the 80s. You could feel the grief in the walls of that place. After the funeral, things moved quickly. The will was read, and the surprises began. August had made Roland the majority shareholder, no shock there. But what no one expected was the clause that named me as interim financial officer. Not Roland. Not his cousins. Me. People looked around the room like they'd misheard. Roland blinked. I sat there frozen, trying to remember if this was some sort of legal error. But it wasn't. The lawyer read it again, slower. Mireille is to handle all payroll and bonus disbursements for a term of no less than 90 days following my death. There was silence. Then the cousins, Travis and Benoit, started laughing. You mean the housewife is going to run the payroll? Travis scoffed. Is she gonna bring cookies too? I didn't say anything. I didn't need to. The smirk said it all. They didn't take me seriously. They never had. I didn't argue with August's wishes. I respected that man too much to turn my back on what he'd put into writing. I figured I'd step in, follow the ledgers, and quietly make sure things kept running smoothly until they brought in someone else. But the deeper I looked, the more confused I got. The factory had always been transparent under August. He believed in open books, fair wages, and making sure the workers were taken care of before upper management got their perks. But the financials over the past year didn't reflect that. The bonuses, which used to be consistent and generous, had all but disappeared in the last 2 quarters. Workers who used to get $1,200 in bonuses were suddenly seeing $200 or $300. There was no major loss in profit to justify the dip. Revenue had stayed steady. So where was the money going? The deeper I went, the more questions I had. I stayed up late most nights, cross-referencing numbers in the ledger, checking account transfers, tracing supplier payments. Roland offered to help, but I waved him off. Not because I didn't trust him, but because I needed to see it for myself. Eventually, I found it. Tucked inside an internal expense account labeled Operational Buffer, E21, was a series of high-volume withdrawals. The description fields were vague: consulting fee, facility inspection, infrastructure review. But the receipts told a different story. One was for a week-long trip to Hilton Head. Another for a company-branded Jeep. Travis had been taking out the funds through a dummy LLC that he and Benoit quietly registered the year before. They were funneling bonus money meant for the factory floor into executive expenses. I felt physically sick. August had died thinking his people were being looked after. They weren't. The men he trusted with his legacy were bleeding it dry behind his back. I didn't tell anyone, not even Roland, for a week. Instead, I started quietly correcting things. I closed the buffer account and redirected the remaining funds into the original employee bonus pool. Then I reviewed August's notes and found a small auxiliary fund he'd labeled Winter Emergency. It hadn't been touched in years. I used it to top off the bonus pool even further. Then I ran a full audit of every bonus recipient from the last 2 years and wrote personal letters explaining that due to internal errors, their missed bonuses were being reissued. The staff received them in the first week of April. I'll never forget that day. People came into the office in shock. One woman named Denise actually teared up and hugged me. She said she'd been skipping groceries to pay off her son's inhaler. Word spread fast. It wasn't long before workers started approaching me, thanking me, asking questions, and, most surprisingly, defending me. Travis made a snide comment at the next all-staff meeting about unqualified hands touching the books, and a union rep named Marlon cut him off cold. I trust Murray more than I've trusted anyone here in 10 years. You could feel the shift in the room. That's when I remembered something August once said at a family dinner. He was a man of few words, but when he spoke, you listened. The people who do the work will always know the truth, he'd said. Even if it takes them time to speak it. The truth was speaking now. And it was loud. By the second week of April, I was receiving more emails than I could keep up with. Not complaints, gratitude. Kind, heartfelt messages from men and women who'd worked in that factory since before I married Roland. People who used to smile politely at me like I was just someone's wife now waved when I walked in. They asked questions. They asked for advice. Some even started calling me Mrs. LeClaire like they had with August. But not everyone was happy. Travis and Benoit were furious. I overheard them in the corridor one afternoon, arguing with each other outside the HR office. I don't think they realized I was in the break room around the corner. She's going to ruin everything, Travis muttered. She already is, Benoit hissed. You said she'd burn out, not take over. I stood quietly, listening, heart racing. They weren't just annoyed, they were panicking. They still hadn't figured out that I knew about the slush fund, and I wasn't about to hand them a warning. If they wanted to keep playing dirty, I'd let them keep digging their hole. A few days later, I called a staff-wide lunch meeting. No formal agenda, just an update. I used it as a chance to walk through where the new bonus funds had come from, explain the audit, and be transparent about where every dollar was going moving forward. I emphasized that it was August's intention to always keep the workforce first. I told them I would honor that. I didn't name names. I didn't accuse. I didn't have to. Everyone knew where the money had gone. When I finished speaking, the room was quiet. Then a voice from the back, it was Elmer, one of the welding supervisors, said loud enough for everyone to hear, "If you ever run for CEO, you've got my vote." There was scattered laughter. But more than that, there were nods. That evening, I went home and sat with Roland on the porch, tea in hand, trying to process what was happening. "You're making a difference," he said. "They see it." "I wasn't trying to," I replied. "At least, not at first. You were trying to protect something good. That's exactly what this place needs." I stared at him. "Do you think your dad planned this?" He didn't answer right away. Then he smiled. "Maybe. Or maybe he just knew who'd do the right thing when the time came." The next morning, I was asked to sit in on the quarterly board meeting. It wasn't typical for someone in my role, but the staff representatives insisted on my presence. I wasn't sure what to expect. I prepared a few reports, brought the audit logs, and wore the only formal blazer I owned, one I'd originally bought for Roland, hemmed down to fit me. When I walked into the boardroom, Travis and Benoit were already seated. They didn't greet me. just side-eyed me like I'd invaded their turf. But this time, I didn't feel like I didn't belong. The meeting started with the usual agenda: earnings, production goals, equipment maintenance. Then, Marlon, the union rep, raised his hand. "I'd like to introduce a motion," he said. "We've reviewed the charter. It allows for a vote of confidence in executive leadership, should the employees petition it." He slid a stack of printed pages across the table. 87% of the workforce signed this. Benoit leaned forward, trying to read. "What exactly are we voting on?" Marlon looked at me. "We'd like to appoint Mireille Leclerc as acting CEO, effective immediately." The silence was deafening. Then voices, first a few board members murmuring support, then someone said seconded, then another added I agree. Benoit stood up, flustered. "She doesn't have the experience. This isn't a bake sale." "I've worked here for 20 years, said one of the plant managers, calmly. "I've seen every single executive you brought in. None of them earned trust like she has in 60 days. I sat frozen, unsure if I should even speak. I didn't ask for this. I never intended to go this far. But something inside me, the quiet strength that had been building, spoke up. "I don't know everything," I said. "But I know how to find the truth. And I care about this place more than anyone who's treated it like a family piggy bank." The vote was cast. 7 in favor. 2 opposed. That's when it happened. Not a celebration. No cheers or applause. Just nod. Quiet, but firm. I was the new CEO. The days that followed were a blur of new responsibilities and new expectations. My office, August's old office, hadn't been touched much since he passed. A few framed photos of the factory in the 70s still hung on the walls. His coffee mug, chipped and stained from years of use, sat quietly on the corner of the desk. I left it there. I didn't redecorate. I didn't rearrange the furniture. It felt wrong to do so. I was stepping into something much bigger than me, a legacy that had carried generations through tough winters, recessions, and even strikes. And I knew, deep down, I had to honor that legacy, not reinvent it. But still, I brought my own rhythm. My morning started before sunrise now. I arrived at the factory while the shop lights were still flickering on and the floor supervisors were pouring their first cups of weak coffee. I walked the floor, shook hands, and asked questions. Real questions, about schedules, equipment needs, personal struggles. It shocked some of the older guys at first, but over time, they began to open up. They told me things they'd never told the previous management team. That the air filtration system in Unit 2 was failing. That someone in procurement had been oppressed junior staff. That new hires weren't receiving proper training because no one wanted to bother the cousins with onboarding processes. Piece by piece, I gathered everything and quietly, systematically, made changes. I didn't announce them with grand emails or all-staff memos. I just fixed things. I brought in an external safety inspector, someone I'd met years ago during a health fair, and had him go through the facility top to bottom. I updated the training program and gave team leads time and paid incentives to support new employees. I even carved out part of our budget to bring in a part-time on-site nurse, something August had wanted to do years ago but hadn't gotten around to. The transformation wasn't flashy. But it was noticed. Roland was a quiet presence during all of this. Supportive, but never overbearing. He offered thoughts when I asked, helped with logistics, and occasionally took over when I was juggling too much. But he let me lead. It meant the world to me. Not everyone accepted the changes so gracefully, though. Travis and Benoit hadn't been officially fired. Not yet. They still clung to their vague titles: strategic development, internal oversight. Titles August had likely given them out of family obligation more than actual need. They started coming in late, avoiding meetings, and when they did show up, they brought an air of sarcasm that was impossible to ignore. In one executive huddle, Travis sat scrolling through his phone while I outlined a new supplier vetting process. When I asked if he had anything to add, he didn't even look up. I'm just here to watch the housewife turn this place into a daycare. The room went silent. I looked at him and said, if you're not going to contribute, feel free to leave the room. He did. 2 days later, he didn't show up at all. That was fine by me. What I didn't realize at the time was that people were watching. Not just workers. Not just the union. But vendors. Clients. Community partners. Word had gotten out that Leclerc Manufacturing was under new leadership, and that it wasn't a Leclerc man at the helm, but a woman. A woman who, by all appearances, had stepped in from the kitchen. Some came with curiosity. Some with doubt. But what they found was structure. Progress. Stability. One of our major parts suppliers called me directly one afternoon to say they were impressed by how our accounts had become more streamlined. Another partner offered us a discount on materials if we signed a 5-year commitment, something they hadn't offered the company in years. It wasn't magic. It was just care. Detail. Showing up. And still, there were moments I doubted myself. Sometimes I'd lie awake wondering when someone would realize I was in over my head. That I didn't have an MBA, or a long resume, or fancy credentials. That I had gotten here by accident. But then I'd wake up, put on my boots, walk into the factory, and see someone smile at me as they punched in. That was enough. It was in mid-May when the inevitable came to a head. I received a call from our legal counsel, the same one who'd handled August's estate, asking for a private meeting. I assumed it was about final paperwork or tax filings. It wasn't. Travis and Benoit had attempted to file a complaint with the company's external board, claiming I had usurped authority and made decisions beyond the scope of her role. The lawyer slid the paperwork across the table. Their complaint was riddled with exaggerations and vague accusations. The kind that reeked of desperation. I didn't get angry. I didn't panic. I just leaned back in my chair and said, "They're digging their own grave." The lawyer nodded. They have no leg to stand on. The vote was legitimate. The board supports you. The staff supports you. Let them shout into the void. I did. I didn't respond to their complaint. I let the board do it for me. Within a week, Travis received notice of his formal termination, citing misconduct and conflict of interest. Benoit followed a few days later. Their desks were emptied quietly. No dramatic scenes. No shouting match. Just silence. They never showed up again. After they were gone, the air in the factory shifted. It wasn't dramatic. There wasn't cheering or gossip. It was just relief. A quiet sort of exhale, like when a thunderstorm passes and the air feels clear again. People went back to work. Machines hummed. Phones rang. But the tension that had been clinging to the walls, the tight-lipped glances in hallways and the whispered side conversations, melted away. It was over. The worst of it, at least. Or so I thought. Because cleaning up a mess isn't the same as building something new. And in their absence, I suddenly found myself looking at everything differently. There were systems I'd patched, but not fixed. Problems I'd inherited that now had nowhere else to point but me. And all eyes were still on me, this time with expectation, not suspicion. I started getting invitations. Industry events. Manufacturing roundtables. A trade expo in Pittsburgh. A sustainability panel in Milwaukee. People were curious about what they called the Leclerc shift. They wanted to meet the woman who went from homemaker to factory head. I didn't know how to navigate that world. I wasn't polished. I didn't know what fork to use at those formal dinners or how to talk about global supply chains. But I learned. I asked questions. I listened more than I spoke. And slowly, I built something out of all of it. I brought what I learned back to the factory. We upgraded our vendor management system. Started a quarterly newsletter, in print, because a lot of our staff weren't exactly the email type. We added weekly department huddles, where anyone could bring an idea to the table, not just supervisors. And we got serious about safety, launching the very first workplace wellness initiative in the company's history. One Friday, I stopped by the break room and found someone reading the new company newsletter. Elmer, again, the same guy who'd first said he'd vote for me. He looked up and grinned. Never thought I'd say this, but I actually like reading about company stuff now. That stuck with me more than he probably realized. At home, things changed too. Roland started talking more about the future, not just the business, but our future. He'd never considered retiring, but now he was floating the idea of maybe stepping back a little, working on the old Chevy he'd been trying to restore for the last 10 years. We started eating dinner a little later, lingering on the porch a little longer. It felt like we'd stepped into a new chapter without realizing it. Our sons, who had both moved out years ago, visited more often. They were proud. One of them, Mitchell, said he was thinking about coming to work at the plant part-time to learn the ropes. That shocked me more than anything. He'd always sworn off family business things, saying he didn't want to be another Leclerc stuck in steel. But now? "I'd work for you, Mom," he said. "Not for the name. For you." It was one of those moments that made all the hard days worth it. But not everything was smooth. There were still mistakes. Big ones. We had a supplier default on a delivery of critical parts, leaving us behind schedule for a major contract. I had to call the client myself, a long-standing account that had worked with August for decades, and explain what happened. "I don't want excuses," the man said gruffly. "You won't get any," I replied. "You'll get a resolution." I spent the next 48 hours on the phone, sourcing replacements, negotiating rush shipping, pulling staff for overtime, whatever it took. We lost money, but we kept the client. Barely. And the lesson stayed with me: don't put faith in old loyalties. Trust must be earned, then earned again. Another time, we had a conflict between two floor supervisors that nearly escalated into a full-on HR situation. It was rooted in something small, a miscommunication over scheduling, but it turned into a months-long grudge that divided a whole team. I had to sit with them, one by one, listen to each side, and finally mediate the issue myself. It reminded me of managing my kids when they were teenagers. Only with more steel and fewer slammed doors. And through it all, August remained a quiet presence. Sometimes I'd find myself sitting in his old office, staring at the picture of him at the plant opening ceremony back in 1982. He had a cigarette in his hand, suspenders tied on his shoulders, that same squint he always had when the sun was in his eyes. A man who didn't say much, but always knew exactly what was going on. I'd wonder what he'd say about all this. About the vote. About the cousins. About me. One night, I sat there alone after hours, the building nearly empty. The lights above buzzed faintly. I picked up his mug, still chipped, still stained, and held it for a while. "I hope I'm not screwing this up," I whispered to no one. And maybe, in some strange way, I felt like he heard me. There was a day in late June, unusually warm for Cleveland, when I called a full staff meeting again. Not because of anything urgent. Just to talk. To share where we were headed. What we were doing. And more importantly, what we weren't doing anymore. I stood at the front, no microphone, just me. And I said something that surprised even myself. "This isn't my factory," I told them. "This is ours. It always has been. And as long as I'm here, that's how it's going to stay." People clapped. Some nodded. But mostly, they listened. Really listened. And I knew, that this wasn't just a fluke or a lucky vote or a temporary fix. This was something real. As summer rolled into fall, the factory was busier than it had been in years. Orders were coming in faster. We were even approached by a Midwest auto manufacturer to produce parts for a limited run of electric trucks. A big deal, not just for revenue, but for reputation. We weren't just the old Leclerc factory anymore. We were becoming something better. And with that growth came attention. The local business journal ran a piece on our unconventional leadership transition. Then a regional podcast invited me on to talk about women in legacy manufacturing roles. The coverage was flattering, but I stayed grounded. I still packed my lunch. Still walked the floor every morning. Still returned calls personally when someone had an issue. But beneath the progress, I kept one eye on the past. Because I hadn't forgotten about Travis and Benoit. Officially, they were gone. Fired. No longer on payroll. But unofficially? They were still trying to slither their way back in through the side door. Word reached me that they were meeting with two smaller subcontractors we'd worked with in the past, whispering rumors about mismanagement, claiming I was tanking the business, offering themselves as consultants to take over contracts we'd once held. They were trying to poach our work. I didn't panic. I did my homework. I dug into the subcontractor history. Found the ones who were still loyal. Called the ones who had doubts. Not to argue, just to explain. I shared our metrics. Our improvements. Our new clients. I gave them facts. Data. And when I needed to, I reminded them of who, exactly, had stolen from their own workforce a year earlier. The smart ones listened. The honest ones apologized for entertaining anything the cousins had pitched. But the cherry on top came in November. We had signed a deal with a new supplier based in Columbus, a mid-size operation that provided precision cast steel parts. It was a big win for us, and I flew down to tour the facility. The owner, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Carla, greeted me at the door and said, "You know, two guys claiming to be from your leadership team came by here last week trying to undercut your price." I didn't even flinch. "Oh?" I asked, keeping my tone light. "Yeah," she said. "Travis and..." What was the other one? French-sounding name. "Said you were just a figurehead. That the real leadership had been pushed out." I smiled. "And what did you say to them?" Carla chuckled. "I said if you're the real leader, why aren't your names on the damn paperwork?" We both laughed. But I left that meeting with an idea. Back in Cleveland, I called my lawyer and asked her to draft a cease and desist for both cousins. I had no intention of suing, not yet, but I wanted it on the record. I wanted something official that made it clear they were interfering with our business, and I had no intention of letting it slide. Then I made a call to an old contact of August's, a quiet man named Leonard who had been in steel contracting since the Reagan years. He was semi-retired, but still had connections. "Do me a favor," I said. "Next time you hear someone asking about Travis or Benoit Leclerc, tell them the truth." "The truth being?" he asked. "That they robbed their own people and got fired for it." He didn't even hesitate. "Consider it done." The real satisfaction came later. In December, a mutual acquaintance told me that the cousins had tried, and failed, to secure a loan to start a new business. The bank had pulled their application after reviewing recent professional conduct. They'd already spent most of the money they'd siphoned off the books before being caught. One of them, I think it was Benoit, moved back in with his mother. Travis was last seen working sales at a used auto lot, of all things. Fitting, really. As for me? We closed the year with record revenue. Every worker got their full holiday bonus. No exceptions. We threw a company party in the break room, just like August used to, with meat trays and cheap sparkling cider. No speeches. Just music, laughter, and warmth. And I stood off to the side for most of it, watching the people laugh and talk. Real, hard-working people who'd stuck through the chaos, who had given me a chance when no one had to. Roland walked up beside me, holding a plate of deviled eggs and wearing the same crooked smile I fell in love with 30 years ago. "Think your father-in-law would be proud?" he asked. "I hope so," I said. "I think he would have liked seeing Travis finally put to use. Even if it's just selling used Hondas." Roland laughed. "Reckon this means you're not just a housewife anymore." I looked around the room. I never was. And that's how it ended. No shouting. No courtroom drama. Just the slow, steady work of taking back what was mine, what was ours, and doing it the right way. Revenge, I've learned, doesn't have to be loud. Sometimes, it's just being the last one standing, with your head high, your books clean, and your people paid.